The quiet hum of the streetlights outside was the only sound I could hear as I stepped out onto the porch. It was late, just after midnight, and the world around me felt strangely silent. Normally, I'd have enjoyed the peace, but tonight, a chill crept over me, like I was being watched. I had just moved into the house a few weeks ago. It was a decent place, nothing fancy, but it was mine. I was used to being alone, comfortable in the solitude of the suburbs. The neighbors were far enough away that there wasn't much traffic, and the night air was always still. Tonight? Tonight felt different. I grabbed the trash bag, tossing it over my shoulder. It was a mundane task, but as I stepped off the porch and onto the gravel driveway, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. There was something off. A tightness in the air, a weight I couldn't explain. I paused for a moment, looking around. The street was empty, but something didn't sit right. My eyes scanned the yard, from the overgrown hedges to the farthest corner, where the trees cast long, twisted shadows, and then I saw him. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow. But no, he was there standing still, almost perfectly still, just outside the beam of the porch light. The figure was tall, wearing dark clothes that blended into the darkness around him. The kind of person who would be invisible if you weren't looking for him. But I was looking. My breath caught in my throat. I tried to speak, but nothing came out. The world around me suddenly felt too silent, like the night itself had paused, waiting for me to make the next move. My legs went cold, rooted to the ground. The figure didn't move, didn't blink. He was just there, watching me. Instinctively, I glanced around, hoping to spot anything that would explain his presence. Maybe he was a neighbor or someone lost. But no one else was out there, just him, standing completely motionless, like a statue. I wanted to shout, to demand who he was and why he was standing there. But the words stuck in my throat. It felt like my body was frozen in place, like some force was pressing down on me, suffocating me in the silence. I couldn't move, a single step forward, just one. The figure's head tilted slightly, like he was studying me. My heart thudded harder against my chest, each beat like a drum in my ears. He wasn't walking toward me, but the feeling in the pit of my stomach told me I didn't want to wait for that to happen. I forced my feet to move, backing up toward the door. The trash bag dropped from my shoulder, hitting the ground with a soft thud, but I barely heard it. All I could hear was the pounding of my own heartbeat, louder than anything else in the world. I fumbled with the door, my hands shaking, and finally managed to get inside, slamming it shut behind me. I didn't look out the window. I didn't have to. I knew he was still out there somewhere, or watching. The house was too quiet. My breathing too loud. I stood there in the dark, my back pressed against the door, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. The silence felt suffocating, thick in my ears. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe it was a trick of the light. Maybe he was just a neighbor out for a walk, just passing through. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I double-checked the locks on all the doors, the windows, before retreating to my room. But the dread stayed with me, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. It wasn't just the figure outside it. It was something about the way he stood there, unmoving, like he had all the time in the world. I stayed awake that night, too afraid to close my eyes. I kept hearing small sounds, scratching, tapping, like something was moving just beyond my line of sight. I told myself it was just the wind, or maybe an animal, but I wasn't so sure anymore. The next morning, when the sun finally crept through the blinds, the yard looked normal. The trash bag I'd dropped was gone, and the grass was undisturbed. Nothing had changed, but I couldn't forget the figure. And when I stepped outside again, I felt it. The weight in the air, the crawling sensation that told me I wasn't alone. That night, I went through the motions, locked the doors, checked the windows, just like any other night. But this time I wasn't so sure. Something had changed, and I couldn't stop the feeling that the man in the yard wasn't the last of them. I went to bed, but sleep wouldn't come. The darkness outside felt deeper somehow, heavier. And I couldn't shake the thought that, at that very moment, someone was standing just out of view, waiting for me. The next day passed slowly, the unease of the previous night lingering in the back of my mind. Like an echo, I tried to shake it off. Life, as it often does, demanded that I focus on the mundane work, chores, errands. But something had shifted in me, a crack in my perception I couldn't ignore. Every little noise in the house made me jump, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder more often than usual. As dusk began to fall that evening, I couldn't help but feel the air growing heavy once again. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the yard, and for some reason it felt like the world had grown a little smaller, like everything was closing in on me. I kept my routine, told myself that there was no reason to be afraid. I took the trash out again, the same as last night, even though my heart was pounding in my chest. I told myself it was just nerves, that I was being ridiculous. But when I stepped outside, I froze. It wasn't the figure again. No, this time it was the quiet, the absolute silence that had replaced the usual rustling of leaves, the chirping of crickets. Not a single sound, not even a breeze. It felt like the world had hit pause, holding its breath, waiting for something. Then I saw him. This time he was standing closer to the house, just a few feet from the porch, his face hidden in the shadows. He was taller than before, his silhouette framed by the dim light from the street lamp. He didn't move, didn't acknowledge me in any way, but I felt his gaze on me like his eyes were boring into my skin. My throat went dry. My first instinct was to run back inside, but my legs wouldn't obey. I was rooted to the spot, my breath shallow and quick. This wasn't just some random passerby. The stillness of the night, the oppressive quiet, it was as if he had been waiting for me. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there. I tried to tell myself that I was overreacting, that I had to stop letting my imagination get the best of me. But everything inside me screamed that this was wrong. I should have turned and bolted back into the house, locked every door and window, but instead I found myself walking toward him. Step by step, I moved closer, my heart pounding, the thudding in my chest deafening in the quiet of the night. My feet seemed to move of their own accord, against every instinct screaming at me to stop. When I was just a few feet away, I noticed something strange. He wasn't looking at me, not directly. His eyes were fixed on the ground, staring down at the dirt, and there was something off about the way his head tilted. It wasn't a natural posture. It was like he was forcing his body to remain perfectly still, too still. I wanted to speak, to say something, but the words stuck in my throat. I felt like if I made a sound, I would shatter whatever fragile silence we were sharing. And then, just as suddenly as I had walked toward him, I stopped. My instincts screamed at me. Run. My eyes darted around the yard, looking for anything, any excuse to look away. That's when I noticed it, the shadows. They weren't moving the way they should. They were too still, stretched out in unnatural shapes, like they were reaching toward me. I jerked my eyes back to the man. He hadn't moved, but I swear his posture had shifted. He was still staring at the ground, his shoulders now hunched forward in a way that looked wrong, like he was waiting for something. That's when it hit me. I wasn't alone. The feeling crawled over my skin like icy fingers walking up my spine. There was something in the yard with us, something that wasn't right, something hiding in the shadows just out of sight. I could feel it, pressing in from all sides, watching, waiting. My pulse quickened. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think straight. Something told me to move, to do something, anything, but I couldn't. My body refused to obey, and that's when it happened. The man, still staring at the ground, finally shifted. He took a step forward, his movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet with its strings pulled by someone or something else. And then, just as abruptly, he stopped. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. All I could do was stand there and stare at him. His face was still hidden in the shadows, but I could feel his presence, as if it were consuming the air around me. The silence stretched on, stretching tighter and tighter, until it was unbearable. And then, without warning, he spoke. Go inside. His voice was raspy, low. But it wasn't the voice of a person. It was cold, mechanical, like it had been dredged up from some deep, dark place. It sent a shiver down my spine, made the hair on my arms stand up. I couldn't respond. I couldn't do anything except stand there, frozen, staring at him. Go inside, he repeated, his voice more urgent this time, more forceful. I finally broke free of the trance, my body moving on its own accord. I didn't look back as I ran to the door, slamming it shut behind me. The lock clicked into place, but I wasn't sure that would be enough. I stayed by the door for what felt like hours, not daring to look outside, not daring to breathe too loudly. The feeling of being watched never left. I knew he was still out there. And somehow I knew that tonight wouldn't be the last time. The air in the house felt heavy, thick with the weight of the unknown. The house that had once felt safe now felt suffocating. The man in the yard wasn't the only thing that had changed. Something had shifted in the very fabric of the world, and I wasn't sure I wanted to know what was coming next. I spent the rest of that night in a daze, not daring to sleep, not trusting the silence anymore. The hours dragged on, each one heavier than the last. My mind kept circling back to the man in my yard, his strange posture, the unnatural way he had moved. His words echoed in my head. Go. Inside they felt like an order, like a command from someone who had no intention of letting me out again. When I finally did fall asleep, it was fitful, my body twitching in response to every creak of the house, every soft scrape of something against the walls. I woke up with the sun just starting to rise, the light creeping through the windows like a warning. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that it wasn't over, that whatever had started wasn't done with me yet. I tried to convince myself that I had imagined it all, that it was just the product of a vivid dream, or too much stress. But deep down, I knew better. Something was out there, in the dark, watching, waiting, and it wasn't going away. By the time evening rolled around, the sense of dread was back. I could feel it crawling under my skin, a constant, nagging itch I couldn't scratch. The quiet outside was too still, too suffocating. The air felt thicker than it should have been, and I found myself glancing out of the windows, more often than I liked. I couldn't help it. It was like the yard had become a magnet for my gaze, as though something there was calling to me, pulling me toward it. When the time came to take the trash out again, I hesitated at the door, my hand hovering over the handle. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to stay inside, to lock every door and window, to pretend I didn't hear the soft, faint sound of footsteps in the distance. But I couldn't. I couldn't keep living in fear, couldn't let this thing control me. I pushed the door open and stepped outside, the cool air hitting my skin like a slap. The yard was still empty, just as it had been the night before. But the silence felt heavier this time, like it was waiting for something. And then I saw him. He was standing at the edge of the yard, almost in the same spot as the night before, though this time he was facing the house. His body was turned toward me, but his face was still hidden in the shadows. He wasn't moving, wasn't doing anything at all, except standing there, his presence looming in the dark. The panic from the night before surged back in an instant. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze, my breath catching in my throat. But this time, I wasn't rooted to the spot. I could feel the blood rushing to my head, the adrenaline pumping through my veins. I wasn't going to stand there like a fool again. Without thinking, I grabbed the trash can and shoved it down the driveway. My footsteps hurried and heavy. I kept my eyes trained on the man in the yard, half expecting him to move, to come closer, to break the silence with some other strange, mechanical command. but he didn't. The closer I got to the curb, the more I realized that something had shifted in the air. It felt colder, the darkness creeping in faster than it should have. I turned back toward the house, my breath coming quicker now, the hairs on my arm standing up as the quiet pressed in on me. The man hadn't moved, but now he was closer. Not much, just a few steps, but enough that you could feel the change in the air. It was like he was closing in on me, like the space between us was growing smaller and smaller, inch by inch. I was still too far from the house, too far from safety. I had to get back inside. But then, something unexpected happened. I didn't look at him. I couldn't make myself do it. Every instinct in me screamed not to turn my head, not to acknowledge him. But I could still feel his eyes on me, watching, waiting for something. And then I felt something in the pit of my stomach, a sudden, sharp pang that told me I wasn't alone in a way I hadn't yet realized. I turned slowly, almost against my will, and saw him. He was no longer standing in the shadows, hidden from view. Now he was in front of me, right there, just a few feet away, his face finally visible in the dim light. But it wasn't what I expected. His features were blurred, almost like they weren't entirely real, like the light couldn't fully touch them. There was a distortion to his face, a flickering that made it hard to focus on anyone. His eyes were wide, unnaturally so, and they seemed to shimmer in the dark, almost glowing. I couldn't look away. I didn't want to, but I couldn't stop myself. His eyes locked with mine, and I felt the world around me shrink. Everything went silent again, the air thick and suffocating. His face wasn't just a mask, it was the absence of something, a gap in reality that I couldn't comprehend. I wanted to scream, but my mouth wouldn't move. My body wouldn't react. I was trapped in that moment, in his gaze, as if everything else had faded away. Then, without warning, he opened his mouth. "Go inside," he whispered, the words impossibly soft but cutting through the silence with a razor-sharp edge. I didn't hesitate this time. The panic in my chest surged, and I spun on my heel, running as fast as I could. My legs felt like they were moving through molasses, but I couldn't stop. I had to get away from him, from whatever he was. I reached the door and yanked it open, slamming it shut behind me. I didn't even bother to lock it. The sense of danger was too close, too real. I pressed my back against the door, trying to catch my breath, but it didn't help. The darkness outside felt like it was closing in, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Quiet, soft, but growing louder with each passing second. I knew, deep down, that I wasn't going to be able to outrun whatever was coming next. The days blurred together after that, the weight of the encounter hanging over me like a storm. Cloud I couldn't escape. I tried to tell myself that it was all in my head, that I was just imagining things, but the feeling in my gut wouldn't go away. I could still see his face in my mind's eye. The way his eyes seemed too wide, too aware, watching me from the shadows. The words he'd whispered, "Go inside," echoed in my ears every time I tried to sleep. I couldn't shake the idea that something was coming for me, that I wasn't just a random target, but someone marked, someone chosen for something I didn't understand. It wasn't just about the man outside anymore. It was about the feeling that I was being watched every moment of the day, even inside the walls of my own home. The next night arrived with the same oppressive stillness that had settled over my house. The hours dragged on in torturous slowness. The silence outside seemed to press in on me, wrapping around the house like a suffocating blanket. I knew what was coming. I knew the man would return, but it didn't make it any easier. When the time came to take out the trash again, I stood by the door, staring out at the empty yard. The air outside felt wrong, as though something unseen was hanging just beyond the edges of my vision, waiting to spring into view. I couldn't explain it, but I knew that tonight would be different. I stepped outside, the cold night air biting at my skin. and glanced around. The yard was dark, just like before, but this time it felt different. The shadows seemed thicker, more oppressive, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just beyond the reach of the porch light. I moved quickly, pushing the trash can down the driveway, but my eyes kept darting to the yard, searching for the man. I couldn't help it. I felt like I was being drawn into something I couldn't control, like I was walking a line between sanity and madness, unsure of what was real and what was imagined. Come. As I got closer to the curb, I felt the familiar prickle of unease crawl up my spine. Something was off. It wasn't just the darkness or the silence, it was the feeling that I wasn't alone. That something was waiting, watching. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw him. He was standing by the edge of the yard, just like before, but this time he wasn't facing me. His back was to me, but I could feel his presence, like he was aware of me even though he couldn't see me. My heart slammed against my chest, and I froze, the trash can still in my hand. I wanted to run. I wanted to lock myself inside, but something kept me rooted to the spot. It was like my body couldn't move, my feet glued to the ground, while my mind screamed at me to leave, to get away from him. And then, without warning, he turned around. His face was still shrouded in darkness, but this time I could see the outline of it, his features. Blurred and distorted, like he was fading in and out of existence. There was a flicker of something, a sense of wrongness, that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. He wasn't entirely human, I realized. He was something else, something twisted. Go inside, he said again. His voice softer this time, almost coaxing, but there was an edge to it, like a command I had no choice but to obey. I couldn't move. I couldn't respond. The world around me seemed to narrow down to just him and me, the yard stretching out like an abyss, a dark pit I couldn't escape. I don't know how long I stood there, locked in place by the force of his gaze, but it felt like an eternity. Every second stretched out, suffocating, until finally I snapped out of my stupor. I didn't hesitate this time. I didn't think, didn't question. I just turned and ran. My feet hit the ground hard as I sprinted back toward the house, the sound of my breath loud in my ears. I could hear the soft crunch of footsteps behind me, but I didn't dare look back. I had to get inside. I had to lock the door. When I reached the front door, I didn't even bother to open it gently. I slammed my shoulder into it, forcing it open and stumbling inside. I locked it as quickly as I could, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the deadbolt. My heart was racing, my chest tight, but I didn't care. I was inside, safe, for now. I backed away from the door, trying to steady my breathing. I didn't want to look outside. I didn't want to know if he was still there, standing in the yard, watching, waiting. But I couldn't help it. The fear gnawed at me, a constant pull, a question I had to answer. I slowly moved toward the window, my fingers trembling as I peeked through the blinds. The yard was empty. For a moment, I almost believed I had imagined the whole thing. Maybe it was just a figment of my imagination, a trick of the dark, something I had conjured up in my fear. But then I saw something that made my blood run cold. At the edge of the yard, where he had been standing moments before, there was something new. A figure, hunched over, its outline barely visible in the shadows. It wasn't him. It was someone else. I couldn't breathe. My heart was pounding against my chest as I stared at the figure standing in the yard. It wasn't him. This time it was someone else. A new stranger, emerging from the darkness like a shadow made flesh. It didn't make any sense. I had locked the door behind me. I had locked it so tight I was sure no one could get in. And yet, here they were. Another stranger, just standing there, motionless, waiting. Their outline was twisted, distorted in the dim light, and though I couldn't see their face clearly, I knew they were watching me, waiting for me to react. For a long moment, I just stood there, my hands gripping the blinds, my mind racing. I tried to tell myself it was a trick of the light, a hallucination, but deep down I knew it wasn't. The figure was real, and it was waiting. I had to do something. I couldn't just stand there like a coward. But what could I do? The strange man who had been there before, the one who spoke in that chilling voice, go. Inside he was gone now. And yet, the new stranger was there, as if following some unspoken rule of the nightmare I couldn't escape. I took a step back from the window, my breath shallow and uneven. What if they were all part of the same thing? What if they were all connected, all part of a twisted game or curse I couldn't understand? I pulled away from the window and paced across the room. My legs felt weak, like they might give way at any moment. I felt a heavy weight pressing down on my chest, each breath coming harder than the last. But I couldn't stay in here forever. I had to figure out what was going on. For the next hour, I didn't dare leave my house. I kept all the lights off, staying as still as I could, listening for any sign of movement outside. I didn't know what to expect, what was coming next, but my mind raced with possibilities. Could this just be a coincidence? Could all these people really be unrelated? No, it didn't make sense. The same strangers, the same time every night. It was too much. Just as I thought the tension in my chest would suffocate me, the clock ticked past midnight. Couldn't resist it any longer. I had to go outside. There was no other choice. Taking a deep breath, I grabbed my coat and opened the door as quietly as I could. The air outside was colder tonight, sharper, as if it was trying to freeze me in place, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. I walked cautiously down the porch steps, my eyes darting around the yard, scanning the shadows for any signs of movement. The figure was still there, standing at the far end of the yard, its back to me. I didn't know what I expected to find. Maybe I thought they'd be gone by now. Maybe I was hoping I could just walk out, ask them what they wanted, and they'd disappear, leaving me alone. In peace. In peace. But that wasn't how it worked, was it? I stepped closer, my heart racing with every step I took. The closer I got, the more I realized that the figure wasn't moving, wasn't reacting to my presence at all. It stood still, silent, its back to me. I was so close now that I could see the way its silhouette shifted in the dim light, the strange way it seemed to stretch and contort, almost like it was in a constant state of motion, though still, eerie as stone. As stone. Hey, I whispered, though my voice felt small and weak, barely a breath in the still night air. Didn't know what to say. I wasn't even sure why I was speaking at all. I just wanted to feel like I had some control over this situation. But the figure didn't respond. Didn't even flinch. It wasn't until I was a mere foot away from it that it moved. Slowly, with an unnerving smoothness, the figure turned its head. I froze. The face was obscured by darkness, just like the others, but there was something different about it, something off. A shape that didn't belong, a wrongness in the contours of the face, as if it had been stretched beyond recognition. It was the eyes that hit me the hardest. The eyes that seemed too wide, too dark, too empty. They stared into mine, and I felt the world tilt, like everything I knew was slipping away. The eyes weren't human. They were hollow, a void staring back at me, pulling me in. I should have screamed, should have run back inside, but my body refused to move. It felt like time was standing still as I stared into the eyes of the stranger. There was no voice, no command this time. Only silence. A thick, suffocating silence that pressed in around us. The stranger's mouth didn't move, but the same words I had heard before seemed to echo in my mind. Go inside. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what was happening. Was I losing my mind? Or was there something worse going on, something far darker than I could comprehend? The tension in the air was unbearable. And then, just as quickly as it had come, the figure stepped back into the shadows, disappearing into the night. I didn't wait to see if it would return. I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the ground as I raced back to the house, slamming the door shut behind me. The night outside was silent again, but inside, all I could hear was the frantic beating of my heart. I had to figure out what this was, who these strangers were, and why they were all appearing in my yard. I had no answers, but I couldn't stop searching for them. Not now. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. Something had already changed, and I wasn't sure I'd make it through the next night. It wasn't the silence that unsettled me, but the weight of it. The weight of knowing that, in just a few hours, the stranger would be back. It had become a twisted routine by now, one I couldn't escape. The fear of not knowing what would happen next, of wondering whether I'd be able to survive another encounter, was eating away at me. As midnight approached, I couldn't sit still. I tried distracting myself watching TV, pacing around the house, but nothing helped. I kept glancing out the windows, expecting to see the figure creeping across my yard again. The chill that had gripped me all night settled deeper into my bones. And then, as if on cue, the yard grew quiet. Too quiet. The kind of silence that felt unnatural, like the world had stopped breathing. I stood up quickly, my feet taking me toward the back door without thinking. I reached for the handle, my hand trembling. The cool metal burned against my skin, and for a moment, I just stood there, frozen. What was I doing? But I couldn't help it. I had to know. I had to see what was out there. I opened the door just a crack, peering out into the dark. The yard was empty. Nothing moved. I felt a strange sense of relief wash over me, though it was fleeting. I stepped outside, closing the door quietly behind me. The cold air bit at my skin, but I barely noticed. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my senses felt heightened, like I could hear every leaf that rustled in the wind. But just as I began to think I had imagined it, I heard something. A soft scuffing sound coming from the far corner of the yard. I froze, my blood running cold. I couldn't see anything at first, but I felt the presence. It was there. I didn't know how, but I knew the figure was near. And this time, it wasn't just one person. I turned slowly, scanning the shadows. There were more of them. Figures standing still, as if they had always been there, just waiting for me to notice. The first figure, the one that had come on the previous nights, stepped forward. The others remained motionless. But the look in its eyes, those empty, hollow eyes, pierced through me. And I knew that this time would be different. Go inside, the voice whispered. But it wasn't just the one figure speaking. It was as if the words were coming from all of them. I couldn't move. My legs refused to obey me. I felt paralyzed, rooted to the spot. And yet, my mind screamed at me to run, to escape. But I couldn't. They were closing in now, slowly and methodically, each of them moving with a terrifying precision. The yard felt smaller with each step they took. I didn't know if I could take it anymore. The fear, the dread, the overwhelming sense of helplessness. But then I heard it, the one thing that broke through the terror. A child's laugh. It echoed through the night, sending chills down my spine. I looked around wildly, searching for the source, but there was no child, no one who could have made that sound. It was like the laugh had come from the air itself, swirling around me, suffocating me. The figures were closer now, their faces more visible, though they still seemed distorted, their features warped. They weren't human, not anymore. And then, just like that, they were gone, disappeared into the night as if they had never been there at all. My heart was still racing as I ran back into the house, locking the door behind me. I felt the walls closing in, the pressure mounting, suffocating me. I couldn't breathe. I had no idea what had just happened, but I knew one thing for certain: something was coming. Something darker, something more twisted than I could ever imagine. And no matter how hard I tried to fight it, I wouldn't be able to stop it. I could feel it in the air, the shift, the change. I knew, deep down, that tonight was the night I would finally understand. Or die trying. I had stopped trying to understand the logic behind the strangers, stopped hoping for any explanation. I had come to terms with the fact that I might never make sense of it. But tonight felt different. Tonight, I wasn't just running away from the fear. I was going to face it. I sat in the darkness of my living room, waiting. The clock ticked, each second dragging on, and I felt my heart hammering in my chest. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind made my pulse spike, but I didn't flinch. I couldn't afford to. When the clock struck midnight, I didn't wait for the figure to appear. I got up and went straight into the back door. This time I wasn't going to hide. This time I was going to confront them. I opened the door, my hand steady on the handle. The yard was still, eerily so. The silence felt like a warning. And then I saw it them. The figures, all standing in the same spots as before, their hollow eyes trained on me. But this time, there was something new. A dark, swirling mist began to crawl along the ground, rising around their feet. It moved like it was alive, like it was feeding on their presence. I took a step forward, my voice trembling as I called out, "What do you want from me?" There was no answer. But the mist grew thicker, swirling faster, until it enveloped the figures. And then, with a sickening lurch, they moved in unison, their distorted faces twisting into grotesque masks of pain and malice. "You should never have looked," one of them whispered. Its voice was 1,000 voices all, speaking at once, the sound tearing through the air like a blade. I tried to run, but the yard had changed. The ground beneath me felt soft, like I was sinking into it. The walls of my house had disappeared, and all I could see was the swirling mist, the faces of the strangers, and the endless void of their eyes. I didn't know if I would ever escape. I didn't know if I ever could. And then, just before the darkness consumed me entirely, I heard their voices again, whispering in my ears one last warning. "You were never meant to survive this. Have you ever felt like you were being watched? Let me know if you've experienced something similar."